So, there certainly seems to be a strong market for independent animation these days. From the overnight success of Digital Circus to a series like Hazbin Hotel getting revamped on a major streaming service, the internet age has brought us some major leaps and bounds for the art of cartoons from creators outside of the established system. Right now, though, I'd like to look back and revisit one of the first big runaway successes in this department that I found a renewed affection for, RWBY. When the show started airing, not only was I one of many existing Red vs. Blue fans intrigued by a fully animated Rooster Teeth show, but I was also just the right age to best relate to the main characters, being 17 at the time like pretty much every main cast member except the one with top billing. Unfortunately, I also seem to be one of many people who started from the beginning and fell off around Volume 6, with only passing knowledge about the later entries. Recently, the downfall of Rooster Teeth and the outpour of fan support to see the story continued outside of the deathly claws of Warner Brothers rekindled my interest in the series. I mean, there is a lot to admire about RWBY. Despite only being around for 11 years as of this month, it's an indie animation that's already seen worldwide recognition, representation in numerous properties, and bested an evil that even more established characters couldn't withstand: tax write-offs. So, that's what I'm aiming to do to celebrate 11 years and an optimistic future with the show's new home. A retrospective of the series season by season, or rather volume by volume, to look back on this little internet show that could, giving my thoughts on each entry episode by episode and seeing how each one stacked up by the end.
Because goddammit, YouTube needs some source of positivity aimed at this series.
I originally planned on including the trailers and a bunch of behind-the-scenes information about the making of Volume 1, and maybe I will still do a more serious deep dive style essay at some point down the line. But for now, I just want to take you guys along for the ride as I reconnect with this show. However, as I did find them to be very important keystones for Volume 1 as character teasers, pretty well made ones at that since they got me excited all over again for a show I've already seen most of, I want to quickly rank and go over my thoughts on the pre-release trailers, then possibly go into greater depth about them in a separate video soon. So without further ado, the first true hint at what was to come with RWBY, and oh boy was it a strong foot forward. Right off the bat, there's some striking visuals and a stellar sense of atmosphere created in the trailer. There's a bit of roughness around the edges to be expected with the first extensive showcase of the series, and that would eventually carry over into Volume 1. But already you can tell there's a lot of confident camera work, framing, and eye-catching visuals that leave a lot to the imagination. Who is this tiny girl with the red cloak and the big scythe gun? What are those big sleep paralysis wolf demons? What's up with that cliffside grave? It does a lot in a short span of time to hint at character and story elements without any dialogue, on top of an excellent first taste of the music with Red Like Roses Part 1. Not only does it do a good job of starting out as an appropriately somber tune with hints of RWBY's motivation, but it pivots organically to a very high energy, dramatic fighting track that still gets you going today. Extra impressive when you consider that the vocalist for this and pretty much every major RWBY track going forward, Casey Lee Williams, was only 13 at the time of recording. She does a great job giving the vocals a suitable emotional weight. As some minor nitpicks, some of the more low-quality sound effects used for the proto-Beowulfs and other things are a bit distractingly unpolished compared to some of the more fluid and imaginative shots. It's also not super accurate to RWBY's characterization, as she's a lot more confident and established for the sake of the trailer, though even Monty himself said he considered this more of a weapon demo of Crescent Rose than a character trailer for RWBY, and yeah, something about that sentiment is very in character for RWBY at least. It is the only one of the 4 trailers that's still debatably canon, but regardless, the red trailer is still a fast-paced, atmospheric, and shockingly well-done appetizer for the greater world of RWBY. 8 out of 10. Okay, so honestly, this one is a bit of a dead heat race with red trailer for my favorite of the bunch. Not that it's all downhill from here with black and yellow trailers, but white trailer does a lot to really convey the depth and emotion of early RWBY in such an exciting form. Taking what worked with red trailer as a kick-ass demo of the aesthetic, music, and combat style, and doing some more consistent character work through it. This could have easily been a very monotone and uninteresting sequence to watch, especially during the fight scene with the dark gray Armagigas amidst a mostly black and white background. Instead, they managed to not only make the visuals of Weiss herself and the backdrop effective and engaging to look at, but imply some depth early on to what could have been a very stock mean girl / tsundere character. They do a really good job of selling how isolated Weiss feels even when performing for a large crowd on stage, conveying that energy and a sense of longing through Mirror Mirror Part 1 that Casey really knocks out of the park. A minor thing that I still appreciate from this is that the perfectionist Weiss is not only shown underestimating her opponent and being put on the back foot, whereas Ruby was a lot more confident and in control of the Proto-Beowulfs, but she ends up earning a scar from the fight that isn't something Weiss beats herself up over, nor do I really recall her being picked on for it as an insecurity later in the show. Also gotta give props to Myrtanaster for being such an interesting weapon, giving us our first look at the more magical elements of RWBY like runes and dust, and personally reminding me of the Brachio staff from Power Rangers Dino Thunder, which is a nice plus. Not really as much to pick apart here, as I really don't want to hold the early scuff against the animators too much, as this and Volume 1 were a big learning curve for a lot of the people involved. It's a slight edge, but this might be my favorite of the 4 trailers. Not perfect, but still exceptionally rich with subtle story breadcrumbs and atmosphere. 9 out of 10. Okay, now we're getting a little bit more confident thanks to all the feedback from the early trailers. Each one seems to introduce some new aspect. For White trailer, it introduced an opening line of text meant to relate to the Spotlight character and interchanging set pieces. This one really takes it up a notch to the point it borders on being an episode 0 for the series. This one gives us the first proper voice-acted peek at the series, and spotlights Blake and her final mission with the White Fang, giving us a glimpse at the kind of hard life she's had to lead and the depth she's willing to go for her, at the time, mysterious cause. And more importantly, where she draws the line in the sand. It's awesome seeing a team dynamic at work with her and Adam, spotlighting that very early mentor and student relationship they had, and setting him up as a pretty major threat down the line due to his Virgil-esque performance against threats that give Blake much more trouble. Speaking of which, I do like the diversity of opponents in the trailers overall. Ruby herself shows us an early version of the Grimm, as does Weiss, but we wouldn't know that quite yet. Blake and Adam are used to show off the more impressive technology of the universe, going up against Atlesian mechs, with some good subtle details in the framing, like the shot of the big bad crabwalker drone moving on the ceiling just over Adam and Blake's head before they fight it. I also suspect a bit of favoritism on Monty's part with Blake, since while every main weapon in RWBY is multi-purpose, we see just how versatile both Blake and her weapon Gamble's Shroud are in combat here. It's a sword and a gun, alright, pretty standard, but one that also has a rope that can let it be used like a grappling hook or a long-range bladed weapon, and the sheath, which also doubles as a bigger blade. For the one with the least nuanced voice casting reason behind it, I definitely feel like Blake was a point of interest for Monty. And Aaron Zek does a really good job with this early on with what she's given. The voice acting for Adam is...
Move up to the next car. I'll set the charges.
What about the crew members?
What about them?
a little flat by comparison, but what can you do? Definitely a much more ambitious and character-rich episode, certainly a good step towards essentially giving us an early first episode, but there are some things that hold it back that I believe the final trailer does even better. 8 out of 10. If Black Trailer was basically Chapter 0, then Yellow Trailer is absolutely the prologue episode to the main show. This trailer not only ups the ante by primarily taking place in Vale, setting up what more domestic life is like in the greater universe, but also gives us a sample of the kind of seedy underbelly in RWBY, to say that it's not just monsters and robots who will be a considerable threat for these characters going forward. No one would know at the time, but you can even see one of the main human villains, Roman Torchwick, early on as Yang enters the club. The whole trailer is a really nice depiction of Yang's character, depicting her as a more confident and easygoing party girl, but one with some serious motivating factors of her own, and that signature fiery temper when her back's against the wall. I know it was probably on purpose, but the sexual hints with her and Junior, despite the latter, knowing that she's too young to be in a bar, is a little gross, but hey, she also punches the guy's lights out for it, so I'm pretty sure it was intentional. Honestly, there's a lot more ambition and polish present in this trailer that makes it shine. From Barbara Dunkelman's energetic performance as Yang, to the stellar visuals and coloration shifts that accompany the club remix versions of all 4 signature songs as they play in the background of the big brawl with Yang and Junior's forces, Yellow Trailer does hold up very well as the final piece of the pre-release puzzle for RWBY, keeping up the few traditions and motifs of the past 3, and building to the ultimate preview of the series that was to come just a month later by that point. Some things are still kinda weird in retrospect, and I definitely question why RWBY is just there by herself at the end, but like all the other trailers, my nitpicks are very minor compared to the excitement they generated, even as someone who already saw most of the series when it was airing. And where else are you gonna see someone use another girl like a pole and then spin kick them in the face? 9 out of 10. So, the trailers already set a pretty high bar. High enough that apparently Volume 1 was pretty much just going to be the Emerald Forest arc at one point, but the overwhelming positive feedback from these 4 trailers led the crew to expand the scope of it. Do the main episodes of the series hold up with that in mind? Let's find out, starting with... Here we are with the first proper episode of the series that kicked things off for real. 11 years ago. Jesus Christ, on a motorbike, I can feel it in my bad hip. Anyway, quarter-life crisis aside, Ruby Rose is a great start for RWBY as a series proper. One of the longer episodes, at least if you don't superglue the part 1 and part 2 episodes down the line together, you not only get a pretty awesome storybook-style opening sequence, with some major fan service for the RVB/Halo fans with Jen Taylor as the mysterious narrator, but a more accurate and endearing character introduction to the primary character in this ensemble. Ruby is adorable in this opening section, and I just can't help but smile even now when I see that shot of her turning around and living up to the "don't try to mug an anime protag" bit very well.
I said, put your hands in the air, now!
Are you robbing me?
Yes!
Oh.
There are still some more questionable animation moments, like how Roman's first speaking lines blatantly don't match up with his dialogue, but the character on display with Ruby and Roman more than make up for that, as does the fight scene on the rooftop between Glinda and Cinder that really set the bar for more imaginative combat and creative use of their environment. We also get introduced to the idea of a huntsman in schools like Beacon that create them, put up as effectively monster hunters and some degree of celebrity. Ruby expresses interest in Glinda's autograph despite a comment from Yang near the end implying that the average person wouldn't know who she is. Honestly, Lindsay Jones really shines even this early on as Ruby. Their portrayal is very energetic and bubbly, but not grating, which really helps with the well-executed adorkable vibe with Ruby as an excitable girl, but notably one who doesn't want to be seen as exceptional or special, which is nice. It's very sparse, but the sibling dynamic with Lindsay as Ruby and Barbara as Yang is already well conveyed in their brief time in this episode. It's one of many things set up as part of the long game of the series, like how Osmond calls attention to Ruby's silver eyes as more than just an aesthetic choice without being too forthcoming, and how Uncle Crow is mentioned well before he even appears in Volume 3. It establishes more of the world, some of the human threats driving the plot forward, Ruby's motivation, and the concept of a huntsman, but still leaves you wanting more, which I'd say is an accomplishment that makes it easier to overlook some of the shortcomings of this earlier section, even if Ruby's first canon showcase would be better handled later in media like Ice Queendom. Kinda nuts that we went from here to DC crossovers though. 7 out of 10. In hindsight, the fact that pretty much everything but the Emerald Forest arc and presumably the previous episode were added as a result of positive fan response to the trailers does explain some of the minor qualms I had with most of these shorter episodes that were seemingly broken into parts for no reason. But regardless, I'm going to try and be more objective by rating each part as individual episodes. For starters, it played as an after-credits bit to Ruby Rose, but I'm gonna take the chance to comment on how kick-ass This Will Be the Day is as an opening theme, because while a shorter version of it plays from here out at the beginning of every episode, it's perfectly suited to the vibe of young heroes trying to prove themselves against dismissive adults, with the rock aspect and Casey's vocals, something I believe her being around the same age as Ruby at the time of recording helped out with, as you can really feel that youthful rebellious/goth energy in the lyrics.
Prepare for your greatest moments. Prepare for your finest hour. The dream that you've always dreamed is suddenly about to flower.
To this day, day, it's still a highlight of the series music-wise and really gets the blood pumping. As for Shining Beacon Part 1 proper, I'll try not to repeat the point in my notes of there being less to talk about now that I kinda understand why these episodes are so short and broken up. But it was tricky adjusting after what was already a fairly short 12-minute opening episode. Regardless, they do still manage to shine at showing off character. This marks the entry of Blake and Weiss into the series proper, amongst a sea of silhouette people that would become something of a meme for the background filler shortcut that it was, which immediately elaborates a bit more on their characters and puts them at odds with each other to set up later conflict. Weiss comes off as much more bratty and impatient in this than the trailer, but you can also understand where she's coming from with Ruby, even if she does go overboard. I also like that Ruby clearly expresses to Yang that she doesn't want to be seen as exceptional, and has a hard time getting excited over people and meeting new ones. She doesn't let Weiss walk all over her after the latter keeps needling the former over accidentally bumping into each other in the courtyard. Blake is given a bit less to work with, but is established as composed, knowledgeable, and reserved, with hints of her lingering beliefs from her time with the White Fang, setting her up well against Weiss. Though speaking of Weiss, yeesh, that girl is shining in broad daylight. They managed to avoid the problem with her in the trailer, but it happens with Ruby as well in the previous episode. Something makes the pale skin of these characters really shine under direct light, to the point of muddying facial features, which is really a problem on a character wearing primarily white. However, I can still overlook that in the short running time based on the character interactions and how it sets up Ruby and the more entry-level audience surrogate / secondary protagonist John arc. I like that they set these two up as friends who share in being awkward fishes out of water, complete with Ruby going full hyperfixation about weapons at multiple points, and John having been introduced in the previous episode as the only one who couldn't hold his lunch on the transport there. There's really not a hint of romantic intentions between him and Ruby from the start, which is nice to see as a change of pace. It's the first piece of this volume with some notably rougher edges in the rendering and pacing department, but still quite enjoyable as our first look at Beacon Academy and more of the students. 6 out of 10.
Hey, wait! Ah, great. Where am I supposed to find another nice, quirky girl to talk to?
Why can't you see you belong with me?
Definitely an improvement over the previous part with even better shows of character, both in a developmental sense for the ones we already know, and setting up more of the extended cast that will become Team Juniper. Naturally, there's a much heavier focus on the former, as this is the episode where we finally see what will be all of Team RWBY interacting. Honestly, props again to Lindsay Jones, because I adore the absolute sad puppy energy with Ruby, as she first complains about Weiss and being left alone by Yang, and then desperately tries to make peace with her, leading to what may be an acquired taste in terms of characterization, but in practice is some fun, sarcastic banter with Kara Eberly as Weiss. I especially love the moment where she feigns forgiveness by going all Valley Girl with Ruby, inadvertently getting John's hopes up in the process, with even that little joke setting up character moments later in the volume. Not really as much problems with the animation this time, which make it even easier to appreciate subtle character things like the markedly unusual introductory speech by Ozpin that makes him seem a bit shiftier than one might expect from a headmaster character in this kind of show. One of my favorite subtle details is in this scene near the end where everyone is in the ballroom before initiation in the next episode, and even the costume choices of the characters reflecting their personalities to a pretty good extent. Yang is a lot more confident and provocative, wearing short shorts and a loose-fitting tank top, Ruby being a bit more reserved in dark but cute pajamas, Weiss having a more elegant nightgown, and Blake sporting a closed-off kimono with hints of brighter colors. And then John in straight-up footy pajamas in front of some guys that Yang ogles so hard that they stop being shadow people, so that's neat. Can't help but laugh in hindsight with Yang pulling Ruby towards Blake so intently, considering later volumes. Sure, you want to go over there for Ruby's sake. Gotcha. Speaking of that though, I also personally love the small moments that culminate through here, like Yang steadily encouraging Ruby to come out of her shell despite being such a protective big sister, then briefly getting into a comedic scuffle like true siblings, and Ruby connecting with the more reserved Blake through their shared love of books. I don't know, just on top of her standing up for herself past a certain point with Weiss, I do like that they gave a character that was so high energy and uninformed a hobby like reading that she could connect with Blake on. Just one of those things that adds a little bit of depth past the basic anime-inspired archetypes that I think really helped Ruby stand out. Oh, and speaking of that, I won't go too much into the music every time, as I'd still like to do a more extensive review of Volume 1 with behind-the-scenes information like I said, but quick shout out to Gold, the track that plays briefly at the end of this episode. The whole song itself is still very heartwarming to me personally, and adds a wealth to Yang's character and relationship with RWBY, as Jeff Williams apparently clarified later that it's written from the perspective of Yang vowing to protect RWBY and be there for her after Summer's death. Bear in mind, RWBY would have been like 5 or 6 when Summer died, meaning it would have been especially devastating as what was likely RWBY's first personal experience with death. All that implied in this song, as well as the sheer lengths Yang is willing to go for RWBY in an appropriately warm and comforting track that I hope comes back in some capacity in later volumes. 9 out of 10. Seriously, I absolutely love this kind of character building in RWBY, even in the background. Right on in with more of Team Juniper and the slow revelation that Ozpin is fucking crazy. For being one of the more broken up episodes, there is a lot going for this pregame for the extended miniseries arc to follow. That makes me genuinely grateful that the fan response encouraged the expansion of Volume 1. I can't imagine things like Team Juniper in general would have been as engaging if we didn't have moments like the opening of the episode with Nora and Ren getting ready for the initiation process, giving us some fun banter mostly from Samantha Ireland as the bubbly, but at times obnoxious Nora, and the late Monty Ohm himself as Ren in the first 3 volumes. Honestly, this is the first episode where we get to see all 8 of the anime opening characters interact with each other, and there's some fun stuff to go off of. From Weiss trying to schmooze with the formidable but humble Pyrrha, played unrecognizably by Jen Brown, aka Agent Carolina from Red vs. Blue, to Jean trying to project confidence in a very strong, but I would imagine intentionally done show of secondhand embarrassment as he flirts with Weiss, and ignores Pyrrha for the most part. Love how they don't let that slide in this episode either. Pyrrha and Weiss suitably punish Jean for being a bit too forward with the latter, and while RWBY and Yang don't beat him over the head, I do like that they gently try to dissuade him from doing that kind of thing again. Could have been a very grating and uncomfortable dynamic with Jean and Weiss, and the girls in general, but they nipped that in the bud for the most part. Speaking of RWBY and Yang though, their dynamic really shines here as we see more of Yang being the protective big sister, but also how she takes the role of helping to raise RWBY in Summer's place seriously, not just coddling her, but actively trying to prepare her to get out of her comfort zone, and even prepare for the idea that they may not be on the same team together. Something only exacerbated as we learn the rules of initiation through Ozpin, literally catapulting students into a forest infested with monsters to form their respective teams, including the fact that while teams are formed based on which student duos grab the same chest-themed relic in the woods, the first person you make eye contact with is set to be your partner for the rest of their time in Beacon. It's played for laughs, but when you think about it, not only is this stuff terrifying to socially awkward and volatile teenagers, but they really sell just how dangerous it is just to become a huntsman with John's reaction. Even RWBY, despite apparently not getting any sort of directory or heads up about Beacon and what to expect, seems to have been trained on the landing strategy part of initiation, which leaves John being the one asking questions to a strangely indifferent Ozpin as both a nice way to clue in the audience and a greater hint at later character development with John in this volume. The format is a little strange, especially considering this presumably would have been included in some form in the original plan, but what we do get is very enjoyable and does a suitable job juggling all 8 lead characters and establishing the rules and stakes involved in just starting out as a huntsman. 7 out of 10.
Mr. Beast!
Well, whereas the previous part at least benefited from being the longer of the 2-parters, this one is especially short to its detriment, but it manages to keep a good flow based off the previous episode and hit the ground running. Pun absolutely intended. Characters on display through action, with RWBY being more crafty and turning a potential disadvantage in Crescent Rose's recoil into an advantage from movement like she does in combat, Yang being more loud and stylish with her rocket-propelled landing, Weiss being more elegant, and John following helplessly like a sack of potatoes, mercifully being saved by the more skilled Pyrrha. On that note, the character banter between duos is on point, with Pyrrha not letting John off the hook for his cockier demeanor earlier, but building on it in a friendly manner that allows them to be more honest with each other. Same for RWBY being a bit more shy and reserved with Weiss, who shows a bit of heart by coming back for RWBY despite seemingly rejecting her at first. Just as well, we not only see RWBY come out of her shell more through combat to give us hints of that girl from the initial trailer, and, in the more definitively canon department, the one who took out Roman's goons and sent him running to get here early like she did. This on top of our first proper glimpse at the redesigned Grimm, sporting a less overtly terrifying but more overly polished bone armor look that really helps them pop. Not a lot to go off of this episode, but not a lot wrong with it either. 7 out of 10. Is it too late to make a would you rather choose a man or a bear joke? Okay, so another one where Team Juniper gets to shine in different fields, with John and Pyrrha bonding and having to the former introduce the audience to the concept of aura, which is essentially like a video game energy field with some degree of precognition, and interestingly seems to come with some kind of ritual and common vow, judging by Pyrrha's wording when she unlocks John's. It also helps quell potential moral concerns with the Grimm and how they're so casually and brutally eviscerated, something that apparently concerned Jeff Williams when he saw the Red trailer before signing on, which might be why none of the other girls fought them in their trailers, but hey. Apparently Casey thought it was cool seeing RWBY cut up black and red dog monsters, so here we are. Good thing too, because where Ren primarily shines is demonstrating combat, providing an interesting visual breakup to a very exposition-heavy segment with John and Pyrrha, explaining how every creature with a soul has aura and how it can heal and be used as an extension of the users, and also demonstrating Grimm as a threat because they not only don't have souls, but more actively attack living creatures, making sure there's no question of how monstrous and unreasonable they are. Kind of important when you see Ren pop one of their heads like a balloon, even if a major continuity error occurs when we see him standing on top of both King Taijutsu's bodies, and they both still miraculously have their heads. We also finally see Blake for the first time since the ending of Shining Beacon Part 2, and a bit more levity with her and Yang following the latter grappling with the more diverse, if a bit comedically Doomsday-esque Bear Grimm to hint at the wider scope of the species, and make for an impressive gauge of her strength when she blasts one across the forest. It's a small moment between them, but RWBY and Weiss do get a little bit of time together, and on top of RWBY being scary as hell one-handing Crescent Rose through a tree out of frustration with Weiss, hints at another new Grimm and does so in a way that preserves its dignity and menace, unlike the newly arrived Ursa who get tossed around and beaten with greater ease by Yang and Blake. Oh, and apparently the reason why we didn't see Blake until now, not even in the background during the launching segment earlier, was because they would have just shown her landing on her feet. You get it? Like a cat. Nice bit of world building hindered by a few more glaring animation errors and some pacing quibbles. Definitely a nice preamble before we really get in deep with the core of the originally planned Volume 1 highlights. 7 out of 10. Another one that definitely suffers from being shorter despite almost definitely needing to have been a part of the original 4-episode batch. This one does keep up some good character building, but also suffers from being so scattered amongst 8 leads in only 4 minutes worth of episode. Okay, to give credit where it's due, I like how we see more of the tension between Weiss and RWBY play out, poking at their respective problems with each other, like how RWBY views Weiss as bossy and snobby, being very cathartic as she again calls out Weiss for her BS and doesn't just sit there taking it the whole time, but in turn giving hints to some of Weiss's depth and frustration without letting her off the hook for what is indeed a bit of a superiority complex. I think her line of, "I'm not perfect, but I'm still leagues better than you," serves as a great encapsulation of that mindset, even if it does lead to some minor heartbreak with RWBY's response.
You don't even know me.
There's some easy comedy like Jean screaming shrilly and Yang going, "That girl's in trouble!" But it does still come across well in practice, as does the little moment of Blake not going, actually, when Yang calls their night relic a cute little pony. We do see exactly how Ozpin and Glinda oversee the progress of the students without intervening as promised, something I originally called bullshit on, but after seeing how Jean and Pyrrha's segment builds up another major threat, with visuals such as scrawled on warnings outside the cave just before the creature inside bursts through said cave, yeah, they weren't joking, these kids gonna die. Excellent design with the Deathstalker too, my god. Especially how damaged and worn it is, implying it's been there for a really long time. Overall, the pacing is a really distracting mess with just how much the crew has to juggle in only 4 minutes of episode, but what's there is good. Great even in the case of the Deathstalker's debut and the character building between Weiss and RWBY. 6 out of 10. Alright, finally another long episode for the season, and one that really exemplifies RWBY at its best, in my opinion. Now I have the opposite problem where there's almost too many good things to talk about in this episode, but I'll try to be concise. For what could have also been a very cluttered mess with 2 4-person teams vying for screen time, this episode really excels in every department. The more anime and cartoon-inspired beats of physical comedy land, as does the butting of heads between Weiss and RWBY as it comes to a conclusion and spotlights both the latter's desire to prove that she's capable but not special, and the former being the one to break the ice and reveal some of the depth to her character, saving RWBY from the Deathstalker that was giving even the likes of Pyrrha and Ren trouble up to that point, and showing more of that heart and genuine care behind that rough exterior. Likewise, it's great seeing the 2 groups come together and try to take a more pragmatic approach to completing the initiation challenge, until the 2 larger grim force them to stand their ground, with Weiss and RWBY encouraging both groups to just take their relics and return back to the checkpoint without facing them. A good character bit that leads into a nice, small moment of Yang getting to appreciate RWBY coming into her own that I greatly enjoy. Of course, them getting away without fighting the established threats would be too anticlimactic, and holy fuck is this an epic and well done fight scene between both groups. Neither team is portrayed as invincible or suddenly undermines the stakes as they break off into their respective groups, with John really coming into his own as a fighter alongside Pyrrha, Ren, and especially Nora. Really love the energy and more wacky methods of her fighting style and how they pay off in this scene, especially when she has time to giggle madly at the camera seconds before delivering the killing blow to the Deathstalker. Very fitting for a character based on Thor, methinks. But man, the first proper fight with Team RWBY against the Nevermore is a fantastic showcase that's amped up tremendously by the absolute banger that is Red Like Roses Part 2. It plays over both fights and gives a lot of oomph to both sections on top of being another one where the lyrics are dense with story implications, sung as an emotionally raw duet between Casey Williams and her mother Sandy Lee, that represents a sort of internal dialogue, or at least a hypothetical one, between RWBY, still hurt and frustrated by her mother's abandonment of her despite promises to come back home, and Summer Rose herself lamenting not making it back home to fulfill her promise despite knowing it was a sacrifice for the greater good, wishing that RWBY wouldn't go down the same path that she did. A real-life mother and daughter relationship really helps amplify the emotions of the track and make the related fight scene that much richer for it, as RWBY, through her team, finally lives up to some of that promise by delivering a very Shadow of the Colossus-esque finisher to the Nevermore. And thankfully the episode doesn't just end there and goes on to see the aftermath of this initiation, with the formation of Team Juniper and Team RWBY respectively. I like the seemingly knowing comment Ozpin gives to Jean in this scene, like he knows about a revelation that'll come in the next few episodes, and was perhaps rooting for the boy anyway from a sense of familiarity to not spoil the later volumes. Likewise, even though RWBY and Weiss come to an understanding enough to work together in the final battle, it's nice that they don't just completely abandon Weiss's problems with RWBY, as Ozpin names her the team leader instead and unknowingly sets up the arc of these next 2 episodes. Speaking of setup, we also check in with Roman again for the first time since Chapter 1, giving us a neat map of the city where the events of the show take place and hints at a more unexpected background threat amidst the more standard struggles that you would expect in an academy anime like this. Honestly, even with some minor polished nitpicks inherent to this early season aside, I can still say with confidence that this episode is a highlight of RWBY's strengths of the series, and partly why I believe it propelled itself into the stratosphere so quickly. From the characterization and teamwork on display, the action, framing, and especially the music, it's just all exceptional in this episode, and I got a hell of a kick seeing it all over again, even a decade later. 10 out of 10. Well, I guess they can't all be winners. It's not even like this one is terrible by any means. I do love that they continue on with the trend of building character by not being afraid to dedicate time to the smaller adjustments of life at a prestigious academy like Beacon. The redecorating montage and excitement Ruby has with this new role is fun, even if the amusing put it to a vote section is weighed down a bit by some of the distractingly low-res sound effects that occasionally rear their head in this volume.
Well, we should put it to a vote. I think we just did.
Likewise, it's nice to see immediate consequences and continued struggle between Weiss and Ruby that begins to boil over as the former resents the latter's position and less professional approach here. There are some weird shots and pacing choices, like how in Professor Port's classroom the cage containing a mysterious new Grimm kinda just appear after Weiss volunteers to demonstrate in the class, and how Ruby very clearly never puts the whistle to her lips either time that she uses it early on. And speaking of Port, I'm not going to comment too much on the awkwardness of hearing his original voice actor in such a prominent role, but...
Huntresses.
Yikes. 5 out of 10. Definitely the weakest one so far. Especially because they do the running late for the first day of class bit with all 8 main characters, and not a single one has a piece of toast in their mouths. Okay, this one is a marked improvement. The Borba Tusk is a nice new addition to the Grimm roster that's actually hinted at on the wall in the previous episode, and serves as an interesting challenge for Weiss. She's already off balance thanks to her own hang-ups with Ruby, singling her out to be quiet despite Blake and Yang also cheering her on, which I thought was a nice touch to show the real root of her problem in this episode. By the end, this episode does well enough showing off and addressing Weiss's flaws and high expectations through the surprisingly knowledgeable Port. Pretty wise for a guy who just lets a Grimm roll around like Sonic in his classroom with nothing between them but wooden desks, but hey. However, even though Weiss does get a rightful reality check that helps her be more amicable with Ruby by the end, it does hint at her own greater depth with an exchange about Port seeing through her as a girl who always got exactly what she wanted, and how Weiss defends herself while conceding that there is some credibility to that claim. However, I struggle with the idea of whether or not they were supposed to be showing Ruby as actually at fault, because on top of her giving some genuinely good advice during Weiss's demonstration in class, and being up far earlier with the rest of Team Ruby in the prior episode, it really doesn't feel like she's done anything especially wrong by the end of this episode. But maybe that was the point, I'm just not entirely sure even now. However, what they do show is Ruby trying to improve as a leader by taking some of Weiss's feelings to heart by more seriously studying at the end, endearing them to one another as they finally reach a middle ground to resolve their introductory communication issues. But not before Ozpin pulls Ruby aside and engages in a more heartfelt moment to pep her up, though with certain lines I can't help but see how that mindset would set up Ruby for a major character arc much later down the line.
You've been burdened with a daunting responsibility, Ruby. I advise you take some time to think about how you will uphold it.
A nice resolution to Ruby and Weiss's issues since Chapter 2, and a suitable way to bring the audience down after the high of Chapter 8 to re-engage with the more mundane aspects of Academy life with these characters. 7 out of 10. On to another growing pains kind of story, and admittedly one of the weaker parts of Volume 1 overall. It's good to see Jean and Team Juniper get their own arc to settle in with the title leads, don't get me wrong. Especially with Pyrrha and Ruby being so keen for Jean to stand up for himself or stand up on his behalf against a frankly sociopathic character in the form of Cardin, leader of another team and prominent bully. I did find myself really getting pulled out of the next 4 episodes because of the extent of the bullying though. I just feel like that wouldn't fly in a place either as prestigious as Beacon, or, more importantly, a place where everyone has superpowers to knock your lights out for messing with them. But, gotta check the bully storyline off the list in this school-based series. And for what it is, this part is at least fine. Starts layering in later important story elements like the Vital Tournament, hints at the prejudice the Faunus face in this universe, and Blake's familiarity / disgust with that, and sports a small but funny moment with Nora that I still love.
Jean, you know if you ever need help, you can just ask.
Oh! We'll break his legs!
But of course, where this episode really works is in characterization. Jean is shown struggling seemingly weeks later to catch up with the other students, making it clear that he's not just gonna magically be on par with the rest of his team overnight. And we see how Pyrrha shows such compassion for Jean and all affected by Cardin's harassment that only grows with the coming episodes. 6 out of 10. Perfectly serviceable, but personally, the basic premise is a lot to buy when someone with super strength and a no-tolerance policy for bullies could just huck Cardin over any of the nearby precarious cliffs around Beacon. Right, so definitely a bit of ebb and flow with these late edition two-parters I've noticed, and that's no different with this continuation. Despite the sketchy premise with the likes of Ozpin and Glinda theoretically being around to intervene, this episode does bring out more Faunus lore and hints to Blake's origin as she naturally butts heads with Cardin on the subject, before humiliating him in the process. Same with Pyrrha, as we get to see more of her trying to help Jean out both in class and with the Cardin problem.
You know, I really will break his legs.
Get yourself a friend like Pyrrha, seriously. It's also here where we finally understand why Jean is so inexperienced compared to everyone else. He acquired fake transcripts to Beacon without having gone through the proper training at any sort of academy, hence him not having his aura unlocked before the Emerald Forest, much less having any idea of what his semblance is. It certainly makes sense of Jean's classic sword and shield setup, as it turns out to be an heirloom from his great-great-grandfather, with that family legacy inspiring him to become a huntsman despite the lack of training. And after stubbornly rejecting Pyrrha's earnest efforts to help him train with the need to succeed on his own, they set up a new source of tension from this development as Cardin climbs onto the roof to blackmail Jean into doing his bidding. A risky move, but eagle-eyed viewers would be able to notice a nice touch right before this, with Cardin being visible poking out of the window and looking up to the roof as the scene between Pyrrha and Jean starts. It's a bit frustrating as a storyline, both in an engaging sense with Jean so stubbornly refusing to act or take the right steps to improve, and how that has consequences that carry into the next two-parter, but just as well from the premise and the almost comical degree that Cardin tests his luck and goes unpunished in a meaningful sense by the faculty. It does set up Cardin well as a hateable and effective bully character at least, which raises the personal stakes involved with Jean being in his back pocket. 6 out of 10. Again, right off the bat, I do love how Pyrrha shows that she's not nice enough to just let these kind of missteps and stupid choices go without a fight, as there's clear tension and resentment directed at Jean for both the actions of the prior episode and his unexplained time spent with Cardin and his cronies at the expense of herself and the rest of Team Juniper. Really refreshing that despite both being so kind and friendly, neither her or Ruby are treated as doormats. Speaking of Ruby, she's the one who helps facilitate change in Jean to make the hard decisions for the sake of his team, albeit by mirroring some of the more potentially problematic rhetoric, or at least her interpretation of what Ozpin told her in the prior arc. The line, "You're a leader now, you're not allowed to be a failure," is sweet in theory, but really breaks my heart to think about with the benefit of hindsight and Volume 9 in mind. I do wonder how intentional the planting of that character seed was. More to the point, I love her banter with Jean here and how she encourages him to act in his team's best interest, putting himself in an especially compromising position when he does finally stand up to Cardin, after he tries to get back at Pyrrha for undermining him through the use of something called rapier wasps. So, yeah, Cardin is a fucking lunatic, which makes the fact that Jean does finally stand up for himself at the end, despite being immediately pulled in for a beating by Cardin's team right afterwards, very satisfying. However, this all does feel a bit abrupt because of just how short this part is, suffering arguably the most from odd animation choices and pacing out of the entire volume thus far. 5 out of 10. Serviceable, but not looking good, John. Man, now I definitely understand why this arc was cut from Ice Kingdom and the manga. It's not even that the payoff or story idea in general was bad. Hell, there is plenty that I do like, such as the expansion of Jean and Pyrrha's dynamic, and how it paints the road Jean still clearly needs to go down to actually improve and catch up to his team's level, not just letting him suddenly be on par with them after the Emerald Forest. It's also cool seeing John get his semblance and finally come into his own, defending Cardin from an especially nasty Ursa with a little bit of assistance from Pyrrha and the first showcase of her polarity semblance. Not exactly a big action-packed segment on par with the previous episodes, but I don't think it was meant for that to be the focus. And again, Pyrrha doesn't just let Jean off the hook for his behavior despite helping him, and he does need to put in the work to make things right afterwards, but they do it in a way where the arc comes to a satisfying conclusion, with the promise of Jean improving by working with Pyrrha and asserting himself over Cardin to protect his secret. Not entirely sure why everyone else so readily agrees to keep the encounter with Cardin, Jean, and the Ursa a secret, especially after Blake and Yang are sent to go retrieve Glinda for help, but oh well. Overall, it's honestly a poorly executed storyline, but not one that weighs down the entire volume too much. It's a good idea for John's storyline, who, by the way, is played well by fellow series co-writer Miles Luna, and I do like how they take pains to emphasize the work needed to catch up with the other Beacon students. But the premise and lack of consequences or meaningful change with Cardin are very frustrating on top of the pacing issues. 5 out of 10. Alright, here we are with the final two-parter of Volume 1. Finally, we get down to the core of Blake's character and expand on the origins implied in the Black trailer and throughout the prior arcs. The White Fang is explored and explained through both a biased history as written by the victor's perspective in class, and through Blake's more sympathetic views, something that causes a good deal of friction between her and Weiss that comes to a boiling point to reveal significant and understandable hang-ups between both characters. Blake being revealed outright as a faunist after some nice hints, not just limited to the cat-like visuals of her bow and the tail on Gamble's shroud when it's holstered, but equally as impressive, they managed to make Weiss seem sympathetic despite her more prejudiced view of the White Fang and the misguided blame applied to faunists as a whole. The way she puts it, giving us perspective of a girl born into a prestigious life she didn't ask for, and bearing the brunt of the consequences by her emotionally abusive father on top of the already traumatic upbringing involving friends and longtime associates of a company she was meant to inherit being executed or outright disappearing, is surprisingly effective and helps to mitigate audience frustration with her as she and Blake clash over the issue. It's this episode that also treats us to what appears to be a weekend excursion with the team in Vale, setting up more of the upcoming Vital Tournament and an extended character roster, such as the facilitator of the faunist discussion between Blake and Weiss, a mischievous monkey faunist by the name of Sun Wukong, and fan favorite, the weird and lovable Penny Polendina. Love the more animated reactions she draws out of the team in her introduction. Really get to see the anime inspiration shine with the physical comedy at a few points that brings some much needed levity to a closing arc, primarily addressing the subject of prejudice in the world of Remnant. There is some clunkiness to it, namely with the animation at some points when Sun is being chased by more basic cops, but the characters introduced and revelations brought out of our existing leads more than make up for these shortcomings. 7 out of 10. And to finish off Volume 1, we go into Black and White and see the return of Roman Torchwick along with the White Fang after their earlier tease at the end of the Emerald Forest arc. How do we handle wrapping these storylines up? Mixed results, I think. Don't get me wrong, it's another case of the strong points being very strong. Exploring more of Sun's character through how he interacts with Blake is something I really love. Despite the more Aladdin-esque start with him in the prior episode, he shows some greater depth through both his concern for Blake as she struggles with her past, but also by noting that while every faunus is familiar with the White Fang, not a lot of them view the extremist group in a positive light, because their actions led to more prejudice against the group overall. You know, see Weiss for that one. In that earlier scene, we also see more of Blake's origin and the more noble beginnings of the White Fang as a peace group meant to keep order after the end of a human-faunus war, but being overtaken by extremists after continued persecution, showing Blake as a small child being pulled into that world. It really does reframe some of her odd patronizing moments with Ruby for being a child when you factor in the things she's been doing since she was a young girl. Sun continues to put in the work as a nice new addition to the series, showing off deductive reasoning to get to the bottom of the dust theft that would go on to establish his parody characterization as a junior detective in RWBY Chibi, as well as holding his own with the awesome, if especially impractical, gunchucks that were apparently one of the first weapons developed for RWBY. Penny really gets some time to shine as well. She amusingly points out to the rest of Team RWBY that Blake was obviously a faunus in a way that makes sense, then has a revelation spotlighted in her major action showcase after Sun and Blake try to fend off the White Fang and Roman alone. And I thought Blake's weapon was versatile. And while the resolution is maybe a little bit rough and lacking in an explicit apology, I do like the progression towards it. RWBY and Yang push back on Weiss for being so cold to the fact that Blake has been missing since the events of the prior episode, and all the time spent searching for her helps Weiss cool down and channel more of that empathy and desire to work with her teammates in the closing scene with Blake. She immediately tries to make changes in how she treats Faunus in general, and even catches herself in how she talks to Sun. However, despite the strong setup of the arc and excellent action showcases to round off Volume 1, I couldn't help but be a bit disappointed by the pacing issues that plagued this one near the end. I definitely would have rather seen John's prior storyline abridged a bit more in exchange for adding to the epilogue of this episode. Maybe finding room to show off Team Juniper one more time before the wait till the next season began? Or maybe at least showing off more of Weiss's inner struggle as she comes to grips with the biases molded by her upbringing that she needs to overcome in order to be a teammate that Blake can trust. The bit right before the credits with Ozpin seems especially out of left field and vague, even though it is cool to see hints at Crow's greater involvement later in the series, and through that, hints at an even greater mastermind afoot other than Roman. And not just the greater reveal of Cinder, voiced by prominent cosplayer and video game spokeswoman Jessica Negri, as a post-credits teaser for Volume 2. But that's where they left off with Volume 1 and the world of RWBY for the following year before Volume 2. Honestly, this might be a bit generous because of how abrupt the ending felt during my rewatch, even bearing in mind the limited timetable and all that. But with how poor the penultimate arc was that it gets cut in every retelling of the first volume, it feels like an especially glaring fault to cut things off so quickly on this one. But at the same time, I really did enjoy both the action and character development that was present in the storyline, and it definitely left me keen to watch more of the series. 7 out of 10. Definitely a rough finish for a promising start, but overall I'd say RWBY more than stuck the landing. This has definitely been a fun journey to revisit the series, and specifically this first volume and the trailers after a decade. It definitely has significant problems, even trying to be forgiving with how experimental the series was, but when Volume 1 has its highs, I can absolutely see why RWBY was such a breakaway hit for Rooster Teeth. Though further research really blurs the line between what I can credit as a long game move from Monty and co, and what was just sorta improvised at the last minute that they had to roll with. On one hand, Monty had notes that extended far enough to include what would become the Ever After in Volume 9. On the other, something as major as RWBY's mom being the one on the hillside grave in the Red trailer was apparently a fairly last-minute call made after an offhand comment from Jeff Williams while pitching the series, and it led to some fairly integral and expertly crafted work that elevated the season. On top of the stellar music, RWBY Volume 1 excelled in its ambition, the creative visuals, and confident framing for energetic and unique action set pieces, and surprisingly rich characters for what could have been a very by-the-numbers shonen-style anime series. It's definitely not without its flaws, especially in the pacing department and through some awkward animation here and there, but something definitely has to be said for how exciting and impactful these episodes are, even a decade later to a jaded old man like me. Overall, I would probably rank RWBY Volume 1 a 7 out of 10. Not perfect by any means, and there are some less forgivable problems like basically the entire penultimate storyline, but the foundation for the series is very strong. When it takes a leap towards something more ambitious, it soars. Not without its rough spots, but absolutely still worth your attention and my newfound respect. And that was my retrospective and ranking of Volume 1 and the introductory trailers of RWBY. What do you all think of this first outing? Do you still think it holds up okay despite the lack of polish in some areas? I'd love to know what you guys make of it in the comments below, as well as what your favorite moments from the first volume were, if you have any. I hope to get back to you guys soon with the next retrospective, so be sure to subscribe and stick around if you're interested in seeing more of this journey through the RWBY series. Take care until then. And now to finish off Volume 1, we go into black and white and see the return of Norman Torchwick. That'd be interesting. Norman Torchwick.
The heart, Cinder. First, we attack her heart.
Jesus Christ.